Hey there, everybody. My name's Kat Bowser. I'm your resident fantasy therapist. Welcome back to my channel. Those of you here for the first time, welcome. My name is Kat Bowser. I'm a licensed therapist. I'm also a writer working on my first couple of novels for publication. And on my channel, I like to talk about what I consider to be the heart of writing, and that's the psychology behind the characters, the world, the word choice, all that stuff. So that's kind of the angle I like to take with pretty much everything I talk about on my channel. So today, this topic has actually been suggested. I'm probably going to say your name wrong. I apologize in advance. By Mai, I think is how you say her name. And they wanted to know that they wanted to put therapy into their story. They wanted to know how to do it respectfully. And I thought this is actually an interesting topic, and there's a lot to cover. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to give you guys kind of a lowdown on therapy and ways that I think incorporating it into your story should be done. Now, obviously, this is not the end-all methods, because therapy is very, very varied. But I think it should give you guys a general view of things that are done right when talking about therapy in books and things that are done wrong. So, that being said, first and foremost, therapy varies. And by that I mean, I am licensed to practice in Arizona in the United States. If I were to go to another state, I would have to be licensed in that state. Some states are very similar, some states are not. So sometimes if you go to another state, you might have to take additional classes or things like that before you get licensed. So one thing to remember is just because you've heard of one way that therapy is done, it's not necessarily the only way. Now, for your stories, if you're writing therapy in your stories, you would need to look up the guidelines for being licensed in whatever location you're setting it in. If you're writing a contemporary in a real life place, probably should do research on that, because I'm not going to be able to tell you the specifics. But if you're doing a fantasy or another like otherworldly story, or you're doing it in a place that isn't real and you can kind of set it where you want, then you have a little more leeway. So what I talk about in this video is going to be just the core elements of therapy that kind of exist everywhere. So another thing I would like to point out, let's get some of the myths out of the way. ECT, electrical convulsive therapy. Do we still do it? Yes. Is it like in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest? No, it is no longer like that. It was at one point like that, but it is not anymore. I have actually observed ECT being done, and the person is given general anesthesia, so they are out like a light. They are not conscious. They use microvolts, so it's not like in the movies and stuff where like there's this vast surge of electricity. At most, you might see the person's hand twitch a little bit. Honestly, that's kind of it. So it is done, but it is not the first choice in any sense of the word. Most of the time, the doctors have gone through several different medication trials before they're going to try ECT. Does it work? Sometimes yes, sometimes no, sometimes partway. It's kind of like, honestly, any medication or any therapy. It works very well for some people. Doesn't do anything for other people. Some people it falls in the middle. It does have the side effect of memory loss. As a general rule, if you get like ECT at like say 9 o'clock in the morning, you're probably not going to remember anything that happened in the morning, but your memory should come back early afternoon, generally. Now, are there exceptions to this rule? Yes, of course there are. It's going to vary by the person. Do we know exactly why ECT works? Not entirely. We kind of have an idea, but we're not entirely sure. The best way that I've heard it described is it's kind of like a reset button for the brain. It's kind of like if your computer's acting up, you restart it. That's kind of the base bare bones version of it. Okay, let's talk about another thing, lobotomies. Yes, they were done in excess. They were done quite often and for horrible, wrong reasons. Are they still done? Very, very rarely. As far as I know, you have to get, you have to go through a wide range of people to get permission to do a lobotomy. Like you basically have to say nothing else is working. This is our last ditch effort, kind of like ECT. And they don't do as much removing or cutting as they used to. It used to be, they would literally remove part of the brain. They don't do that anymore. They cut connections for the frontal lobe. And they do it much more precisely now, because now we know more about, okay, this area controls this area controls this. We know a lot more. But again, it is still done very, very rarely. I would recommend against putting it in your story unless, it's a time period piece. Because honestly, we really don't use them much anymore. It's, like I said, it's very, very rare. And it's very hard to get approval to do a lobotomy. Let's see. Trying to think of the major myths of therapy. I think those are the two controversial ones I wanted to hit first. So let's talk therapy in general. So when you come in for therapy, you're generally given a list of benefits and consequences of the therapy. Here's the benefits, here's what might happen, here is the limits of confidentiality. This is the big one. So in therapy, there is a limit to confidentiality, but it is a very strict limit. There are, and I'm talking about as an adult. I'll talk about kids in a minute, but for an adult, I can break confidentiality in 3 circumstances. 1, you're going to hurt yourself. 2, you're going to hurt somebody else. 3, you've told me about abuse of a vulnerable adult or a child. Those are the 3 circumstances I can break confidentiality. And I have to tell you before I will break confidentiality. I have to say, hey, what you've told me, I have to report it. I'm not allowed not to. And usually we will have the person do it with us. Like if they're feeling suicidal, we will have them seek out help with us. Now, let me address something here. If someone tells me that they are feeling suicidal, does that mean I send them to a hospital? Not necessarily all the time. Hospitalization is an option, but as a general rule, we want to cover all other possibilities before we go that route. So we will call on the person's clinical team, we will call on their family. If they can come up with a solid safety plan and what they're going to use instead of hurting themselves, then we're good. We don't have to pursue it further. Hurting somebody else. This one is a tough one, because the way confidentiality works, if you tell me that you're going to go and hurt someone, but you're not going to tell me who it is, I can't warn the person because I don't know who they are. If you tell me that you have hurt someone in the past, I cannot break confidentiality over that because you're not doing it right now. So that one gets a little clouded, and that one honestly is really kind of it's one of those things where the therapist has to kind of gauge in the moment, okay, does this person have a viable target? Do they have means to get to the target? Do they have like a clear motive to go do it? Are they going to actually do it? So that one is a little, that one varies, and that one's my tricky one. And every therapist I've talked to said that one's a tricky one. So abuse of a vulnerable adult or a child, this one's kind of straightforward. If you're reporting to me that either you or someone you know has been hitting or otherwise abusing a child or an adult who we consider vulnerable, then I have to report it, either to Adult Protective Services, Child Protective Services, whatever. So that's confidentiality. With children, it is a little more complicated. However, what is said in session with a child, I do not have to report it to the parent if the child does not want me to. Now, the parents can request the notes and the records. They're allowed to do that. But if they were to ask me, what did Johnny talk about in session today? I can tell them, he doesn't wish to discuss it. Usually what that leads to is conversation with the parents and the child about, what's kind of going on and why they don't feel comfortable disclosing it. It can get kind of hairy with children going to therapy, because usually the parents want to know everything, and as a therapist I have to respect the child's confidentiality as much as I possibly can. So that's something to keep in mind. What are the big things that I see in stories where therapy is done incorrectly? Well, let's start out with a major one. So something I see done the most regarding therapy in books that is inaccurate is usually the therapy is provided by someone, a character that is known to the person receiving therapy. And they're generally regarded, this is the empathic person, this is the person that you want to talk to. The problem with that is that a therapist cannot have a pre-existing relationship with the person, because we are meant to be a unbiased party. So if you are going to be seeing someone and talking about things that bother you and things that you're trying to work through, if they already have a relationship with you, that unbiased nature is not there, and so their viewpoint is already skewed, and that's a problem. There are some cases where a therapist can have what we call dual relationships. So that would be like let's say they work as a therapist, but they also go to the same church as a person, but they do not interact at the church. They are not involved in a relationship at the church. They're not like in a youth group together or anything like that. Dual relationships are very difficult because you have to be very careful. So this is one I see a lot with stories, is people like to take a character that the readers already know and say, okay, well, we're going to have them kind of work with the person. If they don't have a solid relationship with the character, that's fine. I mean, that makes sense. But if they're already, like, say, friends with the person, or they know them deeper than, say, I would say, like, acquaintance level, then it's not really a fair therapy. So I'll give you an example. Let's say Jimmy is gonna need therapy, and they want to have Eva give him therapy. Eva is the lady who runs, let's say she runs the coffee shop down the street. And let's assume she's licensed, or whatever world you have's equivalent of being able to give therapy. Now, if Jimmy just sees her in passing, probably okay. If he goes and talks to her every day at the coffee shop and they have a friendship, probably not okay. Kind of see the difference there. So that's the main one I see when I see therapy in stories, is that there's usually a pre-existing relationship, and that's a problem. That's a good way to get your license pulled, actually. The other thing, let's see, what are some other things that come up and I think are important. So the way that a therapist approaches a client is going to vary immensely depending on what the client needs. In therapy, we're supposed to be kind of a sounding board, a guiding stance to help the person learn to process things. We help them learn how the brain works. We help them learn how to apply different techniques to help with whatever they're going through. But we are not necessarily going to sit down and say, you need to do X, Y, and Z, because that doesn't help. The person needs to uncover themselves. This is what they're going to do. And that's something that I think I see a lot also in stories, is usually the therapist is very, almost like a doctor, very much, you need to do X, Y, and Z. And while you would do that with some form of therapy, it's usually not done. Let me give you guys an example from my own work. I've had multiple clients. I had one client who responded very well when the therapist took on what we call an authority figure stance. So kind of like they're the expert, they're the doctor, and that worked very well for them. Another one, very casual, because that's what they were comfortable with. The first couple of sessions, even though you're talking about and you're kind of working on what they need to process and work through, the first couple of sessions are really to establish what we call rapport, which is a relationship. In order for me to help someone, they have to feel comfortable talking to me. And one of the things that we do to accomplish that is to get to know them. And so that's really what the first couple of sessions are about. So keep that in mind, that you can have, if you have a therapist character in a story, their approach is going to be very different with different characters. And in session, I don't do a lot of the talking. My clients do most of the talking. I'm there to respond, reflect, help them kind of look into themselves, question themselves, point out inaccuracies, point out contradictions, things like that. But they're going to be doing most of the talking. I'd say in an average session, I probably do 30% of the talking. My clients do about 70%, if that's any help to you. Let's see, medications. Psychiatrists prescribe medications. In some states, psychologists with additional training can prescribe medications. Therapists, counselors usually do not. Like I said, there's some states where they're introducing bills where, like, if you have additional training, you can prescribe very minimal medications. But as a general rule, no. Our focus is going to be on building recognition, coping skills, support networks, all that kind of stuff. Medications are a different thing entirely. Now, does that mean that we won't recommend that they go see a psychiatrist? No. Usually in therapy, medications do help. And the reason they help is they get the person to a state where they can focus enough to work on their coping skills, their processing, all that stuff. Because a lot of times what's happening is their mood is so jumbled, or their anxiety is so high, or their depression's so high, that it's hard for them to really work through what's causing it. Medications kind of take the edge off and let them be able to focus on that. So that's something to keep in mind. Another thing, I will almost always, if a person is having some kind of physical ailment, headache, backache, whatever, first thing I'm going to suggest to them is, have they seen their PCP? Because we want to rule out any physical cause of what they're going through. Like, let me give you as an example, hallucinations. There is a type of hallucination called olfactory hallucinations, and that is your nose. You smell things. Most of the time, these are pretty rare in mental illness. They happen, but they're pretty rare. So what we would want is, we would want the person to go and have that checked out and make sure that there's not something physical causing it. Same thing with other hallucinations or delusions. We want to make sure there's nothing physical that is contributing to it. So let's rule that out. Now, if that's ruled out, okay, now we can focus on therapy. But we want to make sure that we rule out anything physical first. And let's see. Pretty sure I'm not going to cover all of these, because therapy is, like I said, very varied, is very wide range. But I'm just trying to hit the major points that I think are important. let's see. Oh, boundaries are very important in therapy. And boundaries are basically the limits of what the relationship is. So, for example, my clients know at 4:30 my day is over, and while they can technically still call me, they're expected to try and use their other resources first. Let's see here. Setting expectations for behavior within the session. Like, for example, I have no problem people yell and scream and curse and whatever, because that helps people. So I have no problem with that. If somebody starts to become physical, that's a problem. So expectations essentially are what boundaries are. And one of the things that a therapist does is they model behavior that they want their clients to do. So setting boundaries is a way to kind of help the client learn to set their own boundaries. Setting communication expectations is a way to help the client set their own, that kind of thing. So that is a big point in therapy. Time frame on therapy. It really, really varies. I've seen some people for as short as like 4 weeks. I've seen some people upwards of 3 years. It really depends on what they're working on, and depends on where they're at in their recovery. So unfortunately, sometimes what happens is people are seeing a therapist and their insurance will only cover so many weeks. It sucks. It's not fair. I hate it, but you know, sometimes that's how it is. Now, there are some cases when you work for certain companies that you can kind of dip into what we call spare funds, and you can continue to see someone after their insurance runs out, but you can't do that for every single client. Now, if you know that the person's insurance is going to run out and that they're still not at a point where they can go off therapy, then one of the things you would do is help them to identify resources that they can utilize that will help them. You don't want to just leave them hanging dry. But again, therapy varies in time frame. So is it possible that your character could see a therapist for 8 weeks and be fine? Yeah. Is it possible they could see them for 3 years and still not quite be where they want to be? Also, yeah. So that's something you kind of have to decide on your character on your own. I think those are the real major points I wanted to hit. If you guys think of others that I missed or something you want to know that I didn't bring up, let me know. I'll be glad to answer them below. Thank you, me, for suggesting this topic. It's a good topic. And I do love it when stories have therapy in it, because I really need to see more of it, because some of these people, they need some therapy. So thank you guys for chiming in for my video. As always, if you have suggestions or comments, leave them below. I'll get to them as soon as I can. If you don't want to miss when I upload, make sure you subscribe and ring that bell so that you get notified every time a new video goes up. And until next time, guys, stay safe. Have a good one.